Daniel Bromley is the name. An emeritus professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics.
Can you talk first a little bit about, I think you were at Oregon State with Emory Castle. Maybe talk about how that influenced you and what kind of things you took from that experience.
Yeah, I came to economics from the biological sciences. My undergraduate degree was in forestry, and I worked for the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada for about 2 years and became very interested in the administration of public lands and the conflict that the livestock industry had with the ownership of federal lands. And it's still with us. The Sagebrush Rebellion, people out west don't like the federal government. They get a lot of money from it, but they still resent it. So there's that conflict between the public land ownership in Nevada. I think 90% of the land is owned by the federal government. So I came into this from that biological side, and I realized that I was really interested in policy, not plants. I mean, I thought, well, I want to be a forester and all of this, but I found that I was much more interested in the human conflict around that. So I think I asked somebody at the Bureau of Land Management, where does one go to graduate school to understand this stuff? And he said, go to Oregon State and study with Emory Castle. So Castle was of the early kind of generation of economists that were interested in public policy. So that was my formative time with him. Very important participant in the kind of the evolution of what today we call environmental economics, resource economics. So that's where, I remember I wrote a dissertation. Emory was not sure that I could do this. I was interested in the fishery of all things. So I went from livestock to fish. And at that time there was a big conflict over ocean fisheries. Garrett Hardin had written his paper on the tragedy of the commons. So I was, again, very much drawn to this management structural aspect of the environment. And so I had Emory was a wonderful mentor. Some major professors forced their students to work on something for them. Emory was happy to let me work on something for myself, and he would be my mentor. So I kind of used that as I supervised probably 45 PhD students. And I took from Emory the idea that let a young person follow her dreams, follow her ideas, and if it works out, good. And the role of a major professor is to sort of help push this process forward rather than treating a student as if they're sort of a slave of the professor's interests. So Emory he liberated me to think for myself, make my own mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you, I'm just curious actually, so I also went out to a Western school. Do you see a difference in ag econ between West and Midwest at all?
Well, the difference I see is that everybody's embedded in some context. So if they differ, it would be because of the economic and social issues that they confront. So out West, obviously, you have ocean fisheries, you have public lands, you have enormous population pressure on public lands. This was at a time when the public lands were being redefined away from producers of timber and grass for cattle. Okay, that was the original idea of what public lands were for, being converted into recreational sites for an urbanized population. So the federal government was undergoing tremendous redefinition of what the public lands were in the 60s and 70s, because now people wanted to go out in nature and have a picnic, and they didn't want a bunch of cows there messing up the watering hole, as it were, you see. So there was this conflict there. So in the Midwest, you have different kind of issues. So obviously applied economics sort of takes on the flavor of what the conflicts are in the local area. Right. So that difference, yeah. But other than that, I don't think there's a difference. Okay. I wouldn't think so.
When do you think you really thought of yourself as an institutional economist? Was it from the beginning? Did you kind of evolve into it? Or, I mean, when did you get that self-reference?
As I said yesterday, so I came into economics late. I had already been formed as a biologist, so to speak. And so I took this macroeconomics class, and one day I asked a professor, I don't know how I ran across it, but I said, what's this institutional economics? And he said, oh, don't worry about it, it's dead. And as I said yesterday, I've always been a contrarian, so I thought, geez, if it's dead, I want to find out what it's like. Okay, what is this thing that died? Why did it die? So but then I kind of let it drop. And then when I was finishing my PhD, I had a job offer from Cornell and from Wisconsin, and poked around a little bit and realized that Wisconsin had been very influential in institutional economics. And obviously Wisconsin's a great university, so I thought that's where I'm going. So I came into this hotbed, but by then it had cooled down, as it were, but I came into this place where institutional economics had been very influential. The graduate student club in our department was called the John R. Commons group, you see, and we have a John R. Commons lounge. So I was president of our university club, the faculty club, after a while, and one of our big meeting rooms in the faculty club was the John R. Commons room. So there he was on the wall staring at us as we ate our mediocre food. So Commons, you know, I kind of absorbed, I would guess, stuff, and of course the traditions were still strong. By the time I got there, most of the Commons disciples had gone, they'd passed away or retired. Yeah. So by then it was sort of emptied out a little bit. Okay. So I wanted to teach. We had a class called Institutional Economics, and it was owned by an older guy, so I kept waiting for him to die off, and the minute he died off, I grabbed the class. So that's how, I didn't kill him, but I was happy to see him go because that's a class I wanted to teach. Yeah. So I taught that class for like 20 years.
Okay. In writing the book, Economic Interest in Institutions, which clearly a lot of people cite and know, I mean, was there like a certain point in time where you decided this was the time to write a book, or?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that I was ready. Now I look back at it, we're all embarrassed at stuff we did early on, but that's all right, we grow. Yeah, I mean, I wrote this to see if it was possible to teach economists what institutions are and how they can bring them into their models in the way economists were thinking in the 1980s. So this was written, I think, in 1989. So this was a period when all these conflicts were going on, and I thought economists could benefit from having the general ideas from Commons. And I took much more from Commons' other book, The Legal Foundations of Capitalism, rather than from institutional economics, because I think economists work around the legal foundations of capitalism without knowing that they're doing so. So I thought, okay, I can do this. Yeah. And as I said in the introduction to that other book, this book was not very successful. Institutional economists didn't like it because it was too sort of neoclassical, and neoclassical economists didn't like it because it was too institutional. I thought, good, that's right where I want to be. Right. That's right where I want to be. Yeah. I want to go right down the middle in both camps. Yeah.
It reminds me of how Common, one of his first books, Distribution of Wealth, also was using some of the traditional tools in different ways. And
that's right.
I think, I think it's a great down the middle book. It
didn't satisfy you, as somebody said. You know, you're in the middle of the highway. All you get is this. Jim Hightower said this. You get run over if you're in the middle of the road, right? So this was kind of a middle of the road book. Yeah. It didn't satisfy anybody, but it satisfied some people. Yeah. That's all right.
How do you? I mean, to Sufficient Reason, which I think was 2006. I mean, how did you see your thinking evolve?
Sufficient Reason is a book on the philosophy of economics. It's a philosophy book, isn't it? This book is, I call this structural. I was trying to explain structure. These are the working rules. This is how economists can take the legal structure and use our tools to think about stuff. So I think I would say that that's kind of a structural book. The Sufficient Reason book is about how we know what we think we know. That's why I call it philosophical. And it's pragmatism all the way down, okay? And I realize that I've always been a pragmatist without recognizing it. I think I say that in the introduction here, that I've always been, as I said, contrarian, meaning we don't know what we really want until we sort of figure out what's available for us to have. And so that had always been my sort of operating idea. And so then after that, when I I thought, okay, I've done this. I've tried to show economists structure. What economists need help on is truth claims, what I call truth claims. The propositions that economists advance that they think are true. Right? So all economics is about a truth claim. It may not be true, but it's a truth claim. It's a claim about what is true. And many people hear these truth claims and say, well, I'm not so sure. Okay? And those of us who are in public policy, all of us who work on this stuff, what do? But we advance truth claims. Oh, your community would be better if it were maybe merged in with East Lansing now because you find yourself unable to support your rural hospital or something. So that's a truth claim, isn't it? And a lot of people say, oh, not so fast. And so what I tried to do in Sufficient Reason, drawing on, and then after this 1989 book, I really started reading in philosophy, deep into Wittgenstein and these guys, and Charles Sanders Peirce, and others, John Dewey, and learned that Dewey was so profound in helping us understand how ideas take hold. And John Dewey was a guy who said, let's put our values on trial. Dewey said, okay, if you think that's a great idea, let's give it a try and see how it works out. And for those of us who do public policy, that's really nice, because most people out there think that once policy is set, it goes on forever, and it doesn't need to be revisited, and it will work forever. Not so, right? And so the idea of Dewey and pragmatism is let's see what we can figure out. Pragmatism is a uniquely American philosophy because America was this, it's not a melting pot because nobody's melted. It is this stew, right? So you get the Scandinavians, you get the Germans, you get the Irish, you get the Spaniards who came in, and they all came to this empty land. Sorry to the Native Americans, it was not empty. We just killed them off and run them off. But we thought it was empty. We settled it, and you got the German communities, you got the Scandinavians in Wisconsin and Minnesota, you got the Dutch here in Michigan. Each of them came with their own mental models about how the world ought to work. And then they ran into a German who said, no, I don't think that's right. And the Scandinavians, you guys must be crazy. So pragmatism was an American necessity because it brought together all of these cultures who had their own working rules, their own ideas of truth, and all of the old certitudes, right, of the old philosophy didn't work. And so this book, in a sense, was an effort to introduce economists to pragmatism and what will work. And then that hooks in with John R. Commons and reasonable value. Reasonable value. Commons spent a lot of time looking at the decisions of the Supreme Court. When Wisconsin put in its public utilities regulations and all of this, Commons said, okay, if this is going to pass legal muster, we need to see how the courts regard things. And he looked at all these decisions. He said, you know, judges like the idea of reasonable. What is reasonable? Not what's true, not what's perfect, but what is reasonable. And America is a place where what is reasonable got worked out, isn't it? And guess what? When we put together a jury of 12 citizens, what is the standard of truth on whether O.J. Simpson is guilty or not? Well, it's what the reasonable person would conclude. Huh? Now that drives a lot of absolutists crazy because they don't like the idea of reasonable. But what else do we have?
Interesting. Do you think your new book, Possessive Individualism, which is coming out this year, so almost 30 years later now, it seems to be a different book in the sense of you're looking at the real problems we're facing. We have a very different political environment, more of a, maybe even more personal in some ways. I mean, how do you see that book now?
It's a very different book. It's a big book. I don't mean to brag by that, but it's, as you heard, it's a big book. I mean, it takes on the whole structure of American capitalism. These books sort of, the first one is kind of the structural stuff. The second one is a philosophical thing. This book is a diagnostic in terms of trying to understand how we got ourselves in the fix we are in, right? Whether it's, as I said yesterday, whether it's a president who defies, I'll be delicate in how I put it, but a president who defies all norms of presidential behavior, and a lot of people in this country who are exceedingly upset and frustrated, okay? And that's not Trump's fault. As I said yesterday, he just picked up on something that's going on, all right? So there's a lot of rot out in the countryside, isn't there? Why? Right? Most people look at that anger and that frustration, and they either blame the people who are angry, say, well, you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and, you know, move to some place. You know. So I wanted to get beneath the symptoms of this problem that we face in America and in Britain with the Brexit thing. I wanted to get beneath the rise of these kind of neo-fascist folks that are coming to political power in Europe. And I wanted to ask why. So this latest book is a diagnostic about my hypothesis about the world disorder that we face. The first title of that book was called World Disorder. And the publisher, when I sent it to Oxford, they said, well, you know, the reviewer said, we don't know we like that word, world disorder. Actually, it was a play on Henry Kissinger's book. Kissinger came out with a book in 2014 called World Order. So Kissinger was trying to help us understand the emergence of nation states and that structure and all of that. And so I thought, right, we're now looking at world disorder. But the reviewers thought it was a bit grand. So I focused, again, the title focuses on the diagnosis, doesn't it? I mean, when you talk about world disorder, that's kind of a descriptor. Yeah. And so I came to you know, possessive individualism as a diagnostic. I know it doesn't mean anything. People say, what in the world is that? Well, why don't you read the book and find out? So, but that's the book is diagnostic, trying to help people get beyond the superficial, get beyond the anger and resentment that we see in the red counties, get beyond the anger that we see in Britain over Brexit, and situate that anger someplace deeper. And that, to me, that deeper is, I said, the sort of the failure of capitalism to be a source of hope, and to situate the blame on us for our behavior, our selfish, self-centered behavior.
You didn't, by chance, read the book The Fall of Wisconsin, did you?
The what?
The Fall of Wisconsin.
No.
Okay. We'll have to talk about it later. Yeah.
The Fall of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Good.
He references Commons quite a bit. It's a journalist. He writes a book about the changes, the political changes in Wisconsin recently.
The recent political
change.
Ah, yeah. Well, another book that's really hit the thing is called The Politics of Resentment.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now this is a political scientist. She went out and interviewed guys like me, retired guys hanging around gas stations every morning bitching about the world, and she uncovered, she started this book in 2008 or 9. And she uncovered lots of resentment out in rural Wisconsin. Resentment against people like us, Madison, elites, urban, okay? And so this preceded Scott Walker. It preceded Donald Trump by 6 or 7 years. So she uncovered, Catherine Kramer uncovered resentment. And our governor, his book, he wrote a book, I think it was called Unintimidated. Now, what kind of politician wants to write a book called Unintimidated, unless that politician is, confrontational, so on? Yeah. So I didn't know about the Fall of Wisconsin. But yeah, Wisconsin has been, and you have it in Michigan too. We're very similar in some respects. Yeah. Former industrial states, still industrial states, but trying to find their footing. A lot of people left behind. The government is not there to be of much help. Many of them don't want government to help, but they need help, okay?
So we were talking about the Great Lakes kind of School of Institutional Economics, and I think obviously with yourself, Al Schmidt and Warren Sanders would be part of that trio. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences with them? Unfortunately, they're both gone now, but kind of how you work together, or?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned yesterday Al Schmid's involvement with Jim Tosey and the Corps of Engineers. I went to Madison, I should say. I went to Madison in 1969, and that was at the time when the U.S. Water Resources Council was trying to redefine how the federal government was going to interact with others in terms of water investments, okay? So the Flood Control Act of 1933-36 came after the 1927 floods that just wiped out the whole Mississippi River Basin, was wiped out. U.S. Corps of Engineers got going. Was going to build dams, going to control nature, right? We're going to tame nature, and we'll get the Mississippi to bend to our will. And then there was an effort, well, we need to figure out if we're going to keep dredging and building levees and dams on the Mississippi, we need to figure out if the benefits exceed the costs, right? The logical economic kind of thing. And so that was underway in the 70s, and Al was involved in it. As you said, he'd been with the Corps of Engineers for the visiting professor or something. So right away, as I said, I wrote my dissertation on the ocean fishery, but I came to Wisconsin and found myself embedded in this conflict over public investments in controlling nature, as it were. So this was a fascinating time. So my involvement with Al started with that, and there were some of us at Cornell were working on it. So there was a group of us who were advising the U.S. Water Resources Council on how to revise how they would evaluate investments in water control, whether it's dams and locks, whether it was new water supply, irrigation out west. You know, the West was settled by all these big dams and reclamation projects. Again, all that federal money flowing out west, which made them quite wealthy, many of them, and yet they resented the federal government. So that's how we got involved. And so Al and I spent a lot of time thinking about that, both from sort of an institutional perspective, you know, but also a methodological perspective. What is a benefit? What is that? Because the Corps, the federal government will invest in these projects if the benefits exceed the costs. Oh, what's a benefit? Okay. The costs are clear. We know it's going to cost this much for concrete and this much for all this, but what are the benefits? Yeah. Safety from floods, is that a benefit? How do you weigh that against the cost, see? Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my favorite articles of yours is Choices Without Prices, Without Apologies. And can you talk a little bit about that article and kind of how you see that now versus what's going on in the literature today?
Yeah, I've always been really critical of economists who try to put monetary values on everything. I just find it incoherent. Now, let's be clear. There's an ex post and there's an ex ante. Ex post, if someone's killed in an auto accident and they're a young person and they have a lifetime worth of income in front of them, and I can see the widow going to court and saying, you know, that person was a drunk driver and killed my husband or whatever, and I've lost this income stream. That's clear. That's kind of an ex post sort of thing that needs to be remedied, and the courts try to set that right. To me, that's very different than an ex ante kind of thing where you say, oh, we're going to build this dam, and it's going to create all these magnificent benefits out there. You know, people will be able to look at ducks flying over and blah, 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 and we're going to put a monetary value on it. So I've always been suspicious of that. I don't remember the year now, but there was a famous paper by, his last name was Willig, I don't remember, but Consumer Surplus Without Apologies. So consumer surplus is a big deal in this monetary evaluation. So he wrote a paper called Consumer Surplus. There's a big fight in economics about the use of consumer surplus. It's a technical term, we don't need to get into it. But there's a big fight going on among economists about, is that really a benefit or not? So he wrote this great paper called Consumer Surplus Without Apologies. So he was sort of saying, yes, consumer surplus is an important part of benefits. So I had this fellow from Norway come. His name is Arild Vatn, V-A-T-N, which means water in Norwegian, Vatn. And I guess all Scandinavian languages have some version of Vatn. Anyway, so Arild came and studied with me for a year. And this paper was on my mind, and I knew he was interested in this valuation stuff, agnostic like I was. And I said, Arild, we're going to write a paper called Choices Without Prices, Without Apologies. So I just came up with the title of the paper, and I said, now go get busy. And he said, oh, okay. So Harold and I spent a year writing a paper to fit the title that I came up with, because what I wanted to teach economists was that all through life we make choices in the absence of prices, because economists think you can't make any choice unless you know the price. Right. And our point was nonsense. And so that's the origin of that paper. It's one of my papers that gets cited a lot, because I think most people, other than economists, understand that we make choices all the time without price. Right. And guys tease me all the time. We'll go out with a group to dinner at a restaurant, and they'll, yeah, Bromley, what are you going to order tonight? Well, I first got to, don't you want to know what it costs? I said, no. Tonight I feel like, yeah, I don't care what it costs, right? Now it's luxury. You can afford most anything in the restaurants we go to, but that's the point.
Yeah, that's great.
Trying to disabuse economists of stuff that they think is just irrefutable. Yeah. Come on, get serious.
Yeah. What would be kind of a last question? What for younger people who are coming into the profession? I mean, what's your advice, or what are your thoughts regarding specifically institutional economics and that pathway? I mean, we know it's not necessarily the traditional mainstream, but what is your sense of that?
Yeah, I've thought about this in the context of what I assume we're going to spend a little time this morning on, which is sort of steps forward. I guess my advice would be to not get caught up with terminology too much, focus on problems. So I would say to a young person, what you want to do is you want to find interesting problems, and I think what I hope we can pass on to the younger generation is that you find interesting problems, and we'll help give you a frame through which you can look at those problems in a novel way. All right, so that's kind of the first book. I'll show you a kind of a novel way to think about a problem you've been thinking about. And this other book, I'll help you think through methodologically how you might tackle this problem. And so to be more practical, rather than trying to get young people interested in institutional economics, and I'll say a little bit about this later today if we're thinking about going forward, I would focus on helping young people grab a hold of a pressing problem and use some aspects of what we do with institutional economics to look at and to diagnose this problem from a structural perspective, right? The legal, the working rules. So that I'd like to get rid of the adjective institutional in some respects, okay? I'd like to take young people and, shall I use the word entice? I was going to say seduce, but I think entice is a better word these days. Entice them into looking at things that we're interested in, that they're interested in, without making them think they have to learn a whole new kind of economics. Because if we say, oh, do institutional economics, say, geez, I just got one kind of one kind of economics conquered here. You mean there's another one I have to learn? Yeah. See? Yeah. So to me, that would be my thing, would be to get them to look at whether it's cooperatives, whether it's the structure of local government, whether it's water supply, whether it's conflicts over large confinement animal facilities, which are a big deal in Wisconsin. All these little tiny dairy farms consolidating. They got 3,000 cows, 4,000 cows. Local communities hate them, right? They contaminate the water, blah, blah, blah. All those conflicts, those are structural things. So that's where I think we can get, and then as they get into that problem, we can show them that Commons and some of these early people had some ideas. Jim Schaefer, structure, conduct, and performance kind of thing. What's the structure? What's the legal structure out here? What are the working rules? Right? Yeah. How do people behave in the face of those working rules? That's what this first book was about. Here's a structure. Yeah. How do people work in that structure? Right. So I think and then we revitalize it by stealth. Yeah. Stealth. Right? Because you think about many applied economists, that's what they work on. Sure. They work on the legal structure of the economy, whether it's NAFTA, right? Whether it's plant closings, whether it's Uber and Lyft. That's a structural thing about these disruptors. Uber and Lyft, right? They don't own any capital. All they own is their software, and there are about 5 or 6 people in some corner office in San Francisco, right? Who owns the capital stock of Uber? These drivers out there under depreciating the car they're driving, you know? It's the drivers who are bearing the depreciation costs that a normal corporation would have to pay, and drivers are getting underpaid. You know, they're making less than, I think the average is like $8 or $9, $10 an hour for drivers. They're cruising the streets. Streets are full of cars. Manhattan is choked by Uber and Lyft cars sitting there, burning carbon fuel. Okay, those are interesting structural things.
Yeah, right. That's a great idea. Yeah.
How's the economy being restructured? The gig economy. Uber and Lyft says, no, these people aren't employees. We don't have to pay health insurance for them. They're not employees. They're exempt from normal employee-employer relationships. They're free contractors. Oh, very interesting. Yeah, most of these drivers, the average driver works 40 hours a week for Uber and Lyft, and they're making $8, $9 an hour. They're not home with their kids and their whatever. They're out cruising the streets at night. That's what I was kind of talking about yesterday afternoon. Oh, is this the future of American capitalism? Guy comes home from work, 8 hours, tells his wife, sorry, I got to go drive Uber tonight. He's out cruising the highways. Yeah. All right? That's a structural thing, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, interesting. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much, Dan. We appreciate your time and spending with us. Thank you.